On Christmas Eve, Grace Sullivan, a 24-year-old waitress in rural Idaho, serves a mysterious elderly man at her diner. Despite the late hour, she offers him soup and a cookie, a small act of kindness. He whispers, "You are your father's daughter in every way," chilling Grace as her father, a humble medic, died recently. The man, who knows her name inexplicably, vanishes into the snowy night, leaving a cryptic note. Days later, a call from Washington reveals his identity, unraveling a hidden connection to her father's past, promising a life-changing revelation. Love stories of kindness that change lives? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Your support helps us share stories like Grace's, where small acts spark big impacts. Join our community, share your own stories, and let's celebrate the power of humanity together. Hit that subscribe button now. On a frosty Christmas Eve in rural Idaho, the dim glow of multicolored lights from nearby shops spilled through the diner's windows, painting the worn linoleum floor in soft reds and greens. The air carried the faint scent of burnt coffee and pie crust, mingling with the chill that clung to anyone who stepped in from the snow-dusted night. Grace Sullivan, a 24-year-old waitress with tired eyes and a stubborn streak of kindness, moved through the nearly deserted diner, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. She was still raw from her father's sudden death 10 months earlier, a wound that throbbed quietly in her chest, especially on nights like this, when the world seemed to hum with family and warmth just out of her reach. Living with her mother in a cramped apartment, Grace worked part-time at this small, no-name diner, scraping by while trying to piece together what came next in a life that felt unmoored. The diner was quieter than usual, its regular crowd of truckers and locals having vanished to their homes, leaving only a few solitary souls nursing mugs of coffee or picking at slices of holiday pie. The clock ticked toward closing time, and the staff was already in wind-down mode. Counters gleamed from fresh wipes, and the cash register pinged as receipts were tallied. Grace's manager, Joe, a gruff man with a perpetual frown, was eager to lock up and head home. When the bell above the door jingled just minutes before closing, he didn't bother to hide his irritation. "We're done in 15, he barked, not even glancing up from his clipboard. Grace, though, paused. Something about the sound of the bell, sharp and lonely in the quiet, tugged at her. She turned to see an elderly man step inside, snowflakes melting into his thin, threadbare jacket. His long silver hair, tangled and falling past his collar, framed a face etched with deep lines, and his shoes, worn to the soles, left faint wet prints on the floor. He looked like someone the world had forgotten, and Grace's heart gave a small, familiar ache. She thought of her father, a man who'd always stopped to help a stranger, no matter how small the need. "I'll take care of him, Joe," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet resolve. "It's Christmas Eve." Joe sighed, his shoulders slumping in reluctant agreement, and waved her off. Grace approached the old man with a warm smile, guiding him to a booth by the window where the festive lights from outside cast a gentle, almost magical glow across the chipped formica table. "What can I get started for you, sir?" she asked, pulling out her notepad, her pen poised. Her tone was kind, but her eyes searched his face, catching the weariness there, the way his hands trembled slightly as he settled into the seat. "Just some soup, if you've got it," he said, his voice a low, raspy murmur, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "And water, maybe." There was a hesitance in his words, as if he were unused to asking for anything at all. Grace nodded, her mind already racing ahead. She disappeared into the kitchen, her thoughts swirling with the image of the man's frail frame, the way the cold seemed to cling to him. She ladled a generous portion of potato soup into a bowl, far more than the standard serving, and, on impulse, grabbed the last gingerbread cookie from the display case, its red and green icing slightly smudged but still cheerful. She set the bowl and cookie down in front of him, her smile widening. "I threw in the cookie," she said, her voice light but earnest. "No one should miss out on something sweet on Christmas Eve." The old man's weathered hands, knuckles gnarled and skin paper thin, curled around the warm bowl, and for a moment his eyes softened. "This is more than kind," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Grace pause. She shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I don't have much to give," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "But letting someone go hungry tonight? That's not right. Not on Christmas. Inside, she felt a pang of guilt. She wished she could do more, could offer him a proper meal, a warmer coat, something to ease the loneliness she sensed in him. But this was what she had, and she poured her heart into it. The man ate slowly, each spoonful deliberate, as if he were savoring not just the soup, but the moment itself. His eyes, cloudy with age but sharp in a way that unsettled Grace, occasionally flicked around the diner, taking in the faded Christmas decorations, the smudged windows, the empty booths. It was as if he were cataloging every detail, storing it away for some purpose Grace couldn't fathom. She busied herself with side tasks, refilling coffee for the last straggler, wiping down a counter that didn't need it, but her thoughts kept circling back to him. Who was he? Why was he here, of all places, on a night meant for family? When she returned to clear his empty bowl and the cookie's crumbs, the man looked up at her, his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You know," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear, "you look just like someone who once saved my life." Grace froze, her heart thudding in her ribs. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through her confusion and curiosity. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched the dishes tighter. The old man leaned closer, his eyes never leaving hers, and in a whisper meant only for her, he said, "You're your father's daughter in every way." The words sliced through Grace like a blade, cold and precise. Her father, her quiet, unassuming father who'd rarely spoken of his past, whose military service was a shadowed corner of their family story, had been gone less than a year. Grief, sharp and unyielding, surged in her chest, tangled with a bewildering sense of recognition. How could this man know her father? Know her? Her lips parted, questions flooding her mind. But before she could speak, the man stood, his movements slow but purposeful. He placed a neatly folded $5 bill on the table, more than enough for his modest meal, and gave her a single nod, his expression unreadable, but heavy with meaning. "Merry Christmas, Grace Sullivan," he said, his voice soft but deliberate, as if her name itself were a secret. Then he turned, his thin frame silhouetted against the snowy night, and stepped back out into the cold. Grace stood rooted to the spot, the dishes in her hands forgotten, her mind reeling. How did he know her name? Her father? The weight of those 7 whispered words pressed against her, each one a puzzle piece that didn't fit. She barely noticed Joe locking the door behind her, or the quiet drive home with her mother, her thoughts consumed by the stranger's words. 3 days later, her phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, official, calling from Washington. Grace listened, her heart pounding, as the world she'd known began to crack open, revealing truths she could never have imagined. Nothing would ever be the same. Welcome to QAge, a world of shadows and secrets, where her father's past and her own choices were about to collide in ways no one could have foreseen. Grace Sullivan stood rooted to the spot, her heart thudding in her chest as she watched the old man step out into the soft, swirling snow. His words echoed in her mind, sharp and unnerving. "Grace Elizabeth Sullivan, stay here with us." How could he possibly know her full name? She hadn't worn her name tag tonight at the diner. She was certain of it. Her hands, still clutching the damp dish towel, trembled slightly as a chill ran through her. Not from the cold seeping through the diner's glass door, but from the unsettling mystery of the stranger's familiarity. She hadn't introduced herself, hadn't uttered a single word about her identity, yet he'd spoken her name with such certainty, his voice carrying a weight that made her feel seen in a way she couldn't explain. Her pulse quickened as she pushed past her hesitation and rushed to the door, shoving it open with a force that sent the bell above jingling wildly. The night air bit at her cheeks, and she squinted into the darkness, her breath forming fleeting clouds in the frosty air. The snow fell gently, blanketing the empty street in a hush, but the old man was gone. Vanished, as if the night had swallowed him whole. Her eyes darted to the ground where a trail of footprints, fresh and deliberate in the untouched snow, stretched out toward the street before fading into the shadows. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, proof he'd been real, not some figment of her tired imagination. She stood there a moment longer, her mind racing with questions, her heart heavy with an inexplicable sense of loss, as if she'd missed something vital. Back inside, the diner's warmth felt stifling compared to the crisp night air. Grace returned to the table where the old man had sat, her movements slow, almost reluctant. Her hands shook as she cleared away the empty coffee cup and crumpled napkin. Beneath the bill, tucked carefully as if meant to be found, was a small, folded note. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up, as if sensing it held something momentous. She unfolded it with care, her breath catching as she read the words scrawled in a steady, elegant hand. "Thank you for doing the right thing. Some debts take a lifetime to repay." The words struck her like a quiet thunderclap, stirring a mix of gratitude and unease. What debt? What had she done other than serve him coffee and exchange a few polite words? Her mind replayed their brief interaction, the way his piercing eyes had locked onto hers, the faint smile that seemed to carry a lifetime of secrets. He'd said something else too, something that lingered like a half-remembered dream. "You're your father's daughter in every way." The phrase felt like a key, but to what lock? She couldn't fathom. That night, as Grace helped her mother, Ellen, decorate their modest Christmas tree in their small, cozy living room, the encounter gnawed at her. The scent of pine and the soft glow of fairy lights usually brought her comfort, but tonight her thoughts were elsewhere. She knelt beside the tree, carefully unwrapping a glass ornament, its delicate surface catching the light. "Mom," she began, her voice tentative, "something strange happened at the diner tonight." Ellen glanced up from untangling a string of lights, her brow furrowing with curiosity. Grace recounted the encounter, her words spilling out faster as she described the old man's silver hair, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of hardship, and those intense, knowing eyes that seemed to peer straight into her soul. "He knew my name, Mom, my full name, and he said I looked like someone who saved his life. Then he said, I'm my father's daughter in every way." Her voice wavered, caught between wonder and unease. Ellen's hands froze, a fragile glass ornament dangling in midair, its reflection trembling in her widened eyes. The room seemed to grow quieter, the crackle of the fireplace suddenly too loud. "What did he look like?" Ellen asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid of the answer. Grace described him in detail, the stooped posture, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup, the weight of his gaze that seemed to carry decades of untold stories. "How old would you say he was?" Ellen pressed, her tone urgent now. "Late 70s, maybe early 80s, Grace replied, watching her mother's face pale, the color draining as if she'd seen a ghost. Ellen sank onto the couch, her hands clutching the ornament so tightly Grace worried it might shatter. "Grace," she said slowly, her voice thick with emotion, "that description, it matches how your father always described his commanding officer from his time in Germany." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Her father, James Sullivan, had been a quiet man, his past a locked box he rarely opened. He'd served as a medic in the army during the Cold War, stationed in Germany, but he'd shared little about those years. It was classified, he'd say, his voice gentle but firm, closing the door on further questions. Ellen's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she continued. "He never talked much about his service, said it was better left in the past. But he'd mention his commanding officer sometimes, a man he respected deeply. That description you gave, it's him. It has to be." 3 days after Christmas, Grace was working the morning shift at the diner, her mind still tangled with thoughts of the old man. The breakfast rush had slowed, and she was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, his presence commanding the room's attention. He scanned the diner with a practiced efficiency, his eyes sharp and calculating, like someone who'd spent years assessing threats. He approached the counter, his polished shoes clicking softly on the linoleum. "Grace Sullivan, Maria Sullivan?" he asked, his voice low, professional, and carrying an authority that made her straighten instinctively. "I'm David Mercer with the Veterans Affairs Special Recognition Division. Might I have a word with you privately?" Her stomach twisted with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. She led him to the diner's empty back room, where the hum of the kitchen faded to a distant murmur. Mercer sat across from her, his posture rigid, and produced a worn photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. Grace leaned forward, her breath catching as she studied the image. It showed a young American medic, his face grim with determination, dragging a wounded soldier through a muddy forest clearing. Both men were covered in grime, their uniforms stained with blood and earth. The medic wore a distinctive red hat tucked beneath his helmet, a detail that stood out starkly against the chaos of the scene. This photo was taken in 1972 near the East German border, Mercer explained, his tone measured but carrying a weight of significance. The medic is Private James Sullivan, your father. Grace's fingers trembled as she touched the photograph, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. Her father had always been a quiet hero to her, but this image made his courage tangible, vivid. She'd never seen this side of him, never known the intensity of the moments he'd lived through. The man being rescued, Mercer continued, was Colonel Robert Campbell, one of our most valuable intelligence officers during the Cold War. After his recovery, he led several critical operations before vanishing shortly after his retirement in 1989. The official record lists him as missing, presumed deceased. Grace's mind raced, pieces clicking into place like a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The old man at the diner, his face, his voice, the way he'd spoken her name. It was him, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man who came here. It was Colonel Campbell. Mercer nodded, his expression grave. We believe so. Facial recognition from your diner's security camera confirms it. It's the first verified sighting of him in nearly 30 years. Grace's heart pounded, her thoughts a whirlwind of questions. But why me? Why now? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. Mercer leaned back, his eyes softening slightly. Colonel Campbell made a vow after your father saved his life. He swore he'd always watch over the Sullivan family, that he'd find a way to repay the life debt he owed. We believe he's been keeping tabs on you and your mother from a distance all these years, waiting for the right moment to make himself known. Grace's mind flashed to the note, the cryptic words that had haunted her. Some debts take a lifetime to repay. She thought of her father, the quiet man who'd carried the weight of his past in silence, and the old man who'd appeared like a ghost from that past, carrying a gratitude so profound it had spanned decades. Her chest tightened with a mix of awe and longing, wishing her father were here to see this moment, to know his sacrifice had left such a lasting mark. As Mercer gathered his things and left, promising to keep her updated, Grace sat alone in the back room, the photograph still in her hands. She traced her father's young face, feeling closer to him than she had in years. The old man's visit, the note, the vow, they were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to understand, woven from her father's courage and a stranger's gratitude. She didn't know if she'd ever see Colonel Campbell again, but she felt the weight of his promise, a quiet assurance that her family was never truly alone. Grace Sullivan stood frozen, her heart pounding as Mercer's words sank in, each syllable unraveling a truth she'd never imagined. Her father's death had left a hollow ache, but she'd clung to the memories of his quiet kindness, his calloused hands guiding her fishing rod by the lake, his patient voice untangling algebra equations at the kitchen table. Now Mercer, a man she barely knew, was reshaping those memories with a revelation that felt like a seismic shift. Someone, an anonymous benefactor, had been weaving a safety net beneath her family for years. Medical bills for her father's final illness, bills that should have crushed them, had been quietly paid. Scholarships had materialized for Grace at precisely the moment she needed them most, like stars aligning in a sky she hadn't thought to look at. And now Mercer's voice carried a weight of finality as he spoke of Colonel Campbell, a man who, upon learning of her father's passing, had chosen to pass the torch of gratitude directly to her. Grace's mind spun, her chest tight with a mix of awe and disbelief. The Christmas Eve she'd spent offering soup and a warm blanket to a lonely old man, one she'd assumed was homeless, hadn't been a fleeting act of charity. It was, she now understood, the closing of a decades-old promise, one forged long before her birth. Her small gesture had been the final note in a symphony of kindness, a circle completing itself after years of silent generosity. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her father's life had rippled outward in ways she'd never known. If kindness could return like this, slow but unerring, then perhaps the world held more hope than she'd dared to believe. Yes, 3 days later, Grace found herself in the back of a black SUV, her nerves buzzing as it passed through the heavily guarded gates of a military installation she hadn't even known existed in her state. The concrete buildings loomed, their plain facades deliberately unremarkable, like a disguise hiding something far more significant. Armed guards and razor-wire fences hinted at secrets within, and the deference shown to Mercer, his quiet authority, the way soldiers nodded as he passed, only deepened her unease. What was this place? Why was she here? Her heart raced as she clutched her purse, her father's old watch ticking softly on her wrist, grounding her in the midst of the surreal. Inside a windowless conference room, the air was cool and sterile, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound until a man in a crisp uniform stepped forward. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Colonel James Whitaker," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. His handshake was firm, a quick clasp that conveyed efficiency. Silver eagles gleamed on his shoulders, and his eyes held a weight that suggested he carried more than just rank. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. What I'm about to share is classified, but we've received special clearance given the circumstances." Grace's breath caught, her mind racing to piece together what could possibly warrant such secrecy. Whitaker activated a wall screen and a map of Cold War-era Germany flickered to life, red markers dotting the landscape like warning flares. She leaned forward, her curiosity battling her nerves. "Your father wasn't just a medic, Miss Sullivan," Whitaker began, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of respect. "He was part of a highly specialized reconnaissance unit operating along the Iron Curtain." Grace's heart stuttered. Her father? The man who'd hummed folk tunes while cleaning his fishing gear? The one who'd stayed up late helping her with fractions? Whitaker's words painted a stranger, a soldier who, during a covert operation, had saved Colonel Campbell's life, preventing a nuclear escalation that could have rewritten history. The details, he said, were still sealed, locked away in classified files, but the impact was undeniable. Grace's mind churned, trying to reconcile this heroic figure with a gentle man who'd never spoken of war, only of patience and kindness. "He never mentioned any of this," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. Whitaker nodded, his expression softening just a fraction. He wouldn't have. Those operations demanded absolute secrecy, even decades later. He slid a folder across the table, its edges worn, but its contents pristine. Grace's hands shook as she opened it, her eyes scanning documents that detailed a lifetime of quiet intervention. Regular deposits to a trust fund in her name, modest scholarships that had eased her path through college, an insurance policy that had covered her father's medical bills when cancer stole his strength. Each page was a testament to Colonel Campbell's vow, made in the chaos of that long-ago night when her father, wounded himself, had carried him through hostile territory. 3 bullet wounds, Whitaker had said, and Grace's heart clenched at the thought of her father's pain, his courage, his silence. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Whitaker's gaze held hers, steady but not without empathy. "Colonel Campbell promised to watch over your father's family, by any means necessary. He's been honoring that debt for decades, quietly ensuring you and your father were cared for." Grace's fingers traced the edges of the documents, her mind flooded with memories. Moments she'd thought were lucky breaks now revealed as deliberate acts of protection. The weight of it was almost too much, a mix of gratitude and grief swelling in her chest. Campbell had been there, unseen, a guardian she'd never known she had. "But why appear as a homeless man?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though her heart still raced. "Why not just introduce himself?" Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flickering with something like admiration. "Campbell has enemies, even now. His tradecraft, blending in, testing situations before revealing himself, is second nature. That night on Christmas Eve, he wanted to see James Sullivan's daughter for himself, to know his debt was truly honored." Grace's mind flashed to that cold evening, the old man's weathered face, his quiet gratitude as she handed him a blanket. She'd felt a spark of connection then, a fleeting warmth, but now it glowed brighter, a moment heavy with meaning. A junior officer entered, his footsteps soft but urgent, whispering something to Whitaker. The colonel's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing his face before he turned back to Grace. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice softer now. Colonel Campbell's time is limited, but he wanted you to know the truth. Your father's courage saved more than one life that night. It saved countless others. And through you, his legacy lives on. Grace's throat tightened, tears spilling over as she clutched the folder, her father's watch ticking softly against her wrist. The circle of kindness, begun in a war-torn night, had found its way to her, unbroken, eternal. Grace Sullivan stood behind the counter of the diner, her hands trembling slightly as she poured steaming soup into a bowl for a man she assumed was just another weary soul seeking warmth on Christmas Eve. The weight of the ladle felt heavier tonight, her heart carrying the quiet ache of her father's absence. James Sullivan, a man she'd only known through stories and a single faded photograph tucked in her wallet, had been gone since she was a child. Yet his memory lingered, a soft pulse of pride and loss that colored her every choice. When the man, dressed in tattered layers and a worn cap, thanked her with a nod, his eyes held a depth that stirred something in her. She brushed it off, chalking it up to the holiday's tendency to make every gesture feel profound. Little did she know that simple act of kindness was about to unravel a story her heart had been waiting to hear. The next morning, as frost clung to the diner's windows, Mercer, her manager, approached her with a somber expression that made her stomach twist. "Grace," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "someone needs to speak with you." Her mind raced. Had she done something wrong? Was it about the late shift? Mercer gestured to a small office at the back where he activated a wall-mounted screen. The face that flickered into view stole her breath. Older, yes, with lines etched deeper than she remembered from the night before. But it was unmistakably him. The man she'd served soup to, now dressed in a crisp suit, his posture radiating authority. Her heart thudded as recognition hit. "Colonel Campbell," she whispered, her voice catching on the name. "Grace," he began, his tone no longer frail but resonant, carrying the weight of years and secrets. "I owe you an apology for the disguise last night. Old habits from a life of caution die hard." His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through her confusion. She leaned closer to the screen, her mind scrambling to piece together why this man, a stranger yet not, was speaking to her with such intensity. Campbell's gaze, sharp and unyielding, seemed to pierce through the digital barrier, pinning her in place. "Your father, James Sullivan, didn't just save my life in 1972, he continued. "The intelligence I carried that night, because of his courage, stopped a military error that could have spiraled into global conflict. Millions of lives were at stake, Grace. Your father's sacrifice ensured their safety." Her chest tightened, a flood of emotions, pride, grief, disbelief, swirling within her. She'd grown up hearing fragments of her father's heroism, but the details were always shrouded, locked away in classified files she'd never see. Campbell's words painted a vivid picture of a man whose quiet bravery had altered the course of history. She saw her father in her mind's eye, young and resolute, risking everything for a stranger in a war-torn night. Her throat burned as she imagined him, not as the distant figure of her childhood memories, but as a hero whose choices echoed into her present. "When I saw you last night," Campbell went on, his voice softening but no less piercing, "offering a meal to someone you thought was down on his luck, without a hint of judgment, I saw him in you. That same instinctive compassion, that same courage to act when others might turn away. James Sullivan's legacy isn't just in what he did, it's in who you are." Tears streamed down Grace's face, hot and unstoppable, as she clutched the edge of the table. The weight of her father's life, his sacrifices, felt both heavier and lighter in that moment, as if she'd been handed a piece of him to carry forward. "There's more," Campbell said, his tone shifting to something almost tender. "A trust fund was set up in your name years ago. It's matured now, enough to cover any education you choose, any dream you want to chase. Your father once told me you dreamed of becoming a doctor. That path is yours if you want it." Grace's breath hitched. A doctor. The dream she'd buried under years of late shifts and scraped together rent felt like a distant star, now suddenly within reach. Her mind spun with possibilities, each one tinged with the bittersweet realization that her father had believed in her, even from afar. Military personnel quietly excused themselves, giving her space to process the tidal wave of revelations. Hours later, when she stepped out of the conference room, her hands trembled around two precious items. Her father's posthumously awarded service medal, delivered by Campbell's representative, and a letter detailing the educational fund established in her name. The medal gleamed in her palm, a tangible piece of her father's valor, while the letter promised a future she'd scarcely dared to imagine. The world outside the diner felt different now, as if the air itself carried the weight of her father's legacy. The media never caught wind of the full story. Classified operations rarely made headlines. But within military circles, a grainy video began to circulate. It was security footage from the diner, time-stamped 11:52 p.m. on Christmas Eve. In it, Campbell, still in his disguised tattered coat, bowed his head before the small photograph of James Sullivan that Grace kept in her wallet. The gesture was reverent, a silent acknowledgement of a debt that spanned decades. Grace watched the clip later, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and humility. That moment, captured unknowingly, felt like a bridge between her father's past and her present. A week later, the Veteran Support Foundation reached out with an offer that felt like fate. They wanted her to become an ambassador for their winter relief programs, a role that came with a stipend and hours flexible enough to accommodate her upcoming medical school applications. Grace accepted, her heart pounding with purpose. The idea of helping others, of carrying forward the compassion she'd shown that Christmas Eve, felt like a calling her father would have understood. That spring, a package arrived, its contents stealing her breath once more. Her father's red medic cap, the same one from the 1972 photograph that had defined her image of him. Tucked inside was a note in Campbell's unmistakable handwriting. From one Sullivan to another, the legacy continues. Grace held the cap to her chest, tears blurring her vision as she imagined her father wearing it, rushing through chests to save lives. It was more than an object. It was a mantle, a challenge to live up to the man he'd been. When Grace returned to the diner, it wasn't as a waitress pouring coffee or clearing plates. She came as the sponsor of a new tradition, a free Christmas Eve dinner for veterans and anyone spending the holiday alone. The idea had sparked in her heart after Campbell's revelation, a way to honor her father's belief that no one should face darkness in isolation. The diner, once quiet on holiday evenings, transformed into a beacon of warmth. Tables overflowed with people, elderly veterans swapping stories, families struggling to make ends meet, solitary travelers seeking connection. Grace moved among them, her heart full, ensuring every guest felt seen. At the center of it all was the Sullivan table, a reserved spot that remained empty each year, a symbolic nod to her father's presence. A framed photograph of James Sullivan sat there, his red medic cap carefully placed beside it, as if he were joining the celebration. Grace's chest ached with pride every time she glanced at it, imagining her father's quiet smile approving of the scene. One Christmas Eve, a young boy recently placed in foster care after losing his parents, approached the Sullivan table hesitantly. His small frame seemed to carry the weight of his grief, and Grace's heart clenched at the sight. She knelt beside him, her smile warm and inviting. "Would you like to sit here?" she asked softly. "My father always said no one should eat alone on Christmas." The boy nodded, his eyes wide as he studied the photograph and the curious red cap. "Was he a soldier?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's throat tightened, but she smiled. "He was a healer," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "Someone who helped people when they needed it most." The boy's eyes lingered on the photograph, as if searching for answers in the face of a man he'd never met. Grace stayed by his side, sensing the fragile hope in his gaze, and vowed silently to make sure he felt cared for, not just tonight, but in the days to come. As the evening unfolded, the diner buzzed with laughter and conversation, a tapestry of lives woven together by shared humanity. Grace paused when the door chimed, and Mercer stepped inside, his eyes catching hers with a nod of respect. He handed her an envelope, and her pulse quickened as she recognized the handwriting inside. "The circle continues. Well done." The words sent a shiver through her, a quiet confirmation that her efforts mattered. Whether Campbell himself was watching from the crowd or one of his associates carried the message, it didn't matter. What mattered was the chain of kindness, unbroken and stretching forward, touching lives she'd never fully know. Snow fell gently outside, dusting the windows as Grace looked out over the gathering. Strangers had become something more, a fleeting community bound by the simple act of sharing a meal. Her father's spirit, his unwavering belief in doing what was right, pulsed through the room. She felt it in every smile, every shared story, every moment of connection. Some gifts, she realized, didn't come wrapped in paper or tied with bows. They were forged in quiet moments of compassion, in meals offered without expectation, in debts repaid across decades. Her father would have approved, and that thought warmed her more than the diner's glowing lights.